in interesting times for the headlines. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called for pressure to be maintained on North Korea as concerns mount that Pyongyang is making slow progress towards denuclearization. North Korea's foreign minister criticized the U.S. for urging that sanctions be maintained against Pyongyang. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi defended China's military buildup in the South China Sea, calling it actions taken in self-defense in response to security pressure from the U.S. and other non-regional countries. And meet Carlos Antonio Santa Maria Diaz. He may be only 12 years old, but he has already enrolled in the National Autonomous University of Mexico and will begin his biomedical physics studies on Monday. I'm Alma Angeles, wherever you're watching from around the world. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And now to the news. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called for pressure to be maintained on North Korea as concerns mount that Pyongyang is making slow progress towards denuclearization. In Singapore, ahead of a major security forum, Pompeo called for maintaining diplomatic and economic pressure against Pyongyang.
I've also emphasized the importance of maintaining diplomatic and economic pressure on North Korea to achieve the final fully verified denuclearization of the DPRK, as agreed to by Chairman Kim.
To recall, at a landmark summit with President Trump in June, the North's leader, Kim Jong-un, signed up to a vague commitment to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, a far cry from long-standing U.S. demands for complete, verifiable, and irreversible disarmament. While there have been small signs of progress since the summit, news reports indicate Pyongyang is continuing to build rockets, and there have been concerns that some member states are relaxing the enforcement of UN sanctions on the North. Meanwhile, North Korea's foreign minister criticized the United States for urging that sanctions be maintained against Pyongyang after Secretary of State Mike Pompeo asked the international community to keep up pressure against the reclusive regime. He said despite goodwill measures taken by the North, Washington was raising its voice louder for maintaining the sanctions against the DPRK. This is according to the North's Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho. He told this to a security forum in Singapore, and this is his statement. DPRK are the initials of the North's official name. Staying in ASEAN, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi defended China's military buildup in the South China Sea. He called it actions taken in self-defense in response to security pressure from the United States and other non-regional countries.
第二个消极的动向就是一些域外国家，主要是美国，那么把大规模的战略性的武器频繁地开进这个地区，尤其是南海地区，在这个地区耀武扬威，构成了对包括中国在内的本地区国家安全上的威胁和压力。恐怕这才是军事化的一个地区军事化的一个最大的推手。
Citing aircraft carrier fleets, strategic heavy-duty bombers, and other advanced weaponries, Mr. Wang said, in the face of such mounting military threat and pressure, regional countries, including China, have naturally resorted to self-preservation and self-defense and have put in place defensive facilities. He accused non-regional countries of trying to stir up trouble at the East Asia Summit, a meeting of ASEAN and 8 non-member countries, Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, Russia, South Korea, and the U.S. He said, quote, "We hope they will show greater understanding and support for the positive efforts made by regional countries, China and ASEAN included, for peace and stability. These efforts include the single draft negotiation text for the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, announced on Thursday and agreed on by ASEAN and China in June." Mr. Wang said these negotiations can be placed on the fast track if there are no disturbances from outside. Now, commenting on Pompeo's policy statements made during his trip through Southeast Asia this week, this is what he said.
我们注意到，国庆先生这几天在我们这个地区访问了一些国家，也发表了一些政策性的演讲。给我印象比较深的，他提到这个地区的各国的主权都不应该受到威胁，而且明确地表示美国不谋求在这个地区的支配地位。考虑到美国迄今为止的在这个世界上的所作所为，我们听到这个话感到很难得，因为过去很少听到。但既然说到了，我们就需要。
Now, even a record heat wave will not keep Claire Lee from joining tens of thousands of South Korean women at a mass protest against secretly filmed spy cam pornography as anger over the issue swells, prompting national soul-searching. Take a look. Now, since May, the monthly demonstration in Seoul has shattered records to become the biggest ever women's protest in South Korea, where the global hashtag #MeToo movement has unleashed an unprecedented wave of female-led activism. The target of their fury, so-called molka, or spy cam videos, which largely involved men secretly filming women in schools, offices, trains, toilets, and changing rooms, and which are so prevalent they make headlines on a daily basis.
회사에 있는 화장실 혹은 회사에 있는 책상 아래 이런 곳에 몰래카메라가 설치되어 있을지도 모르는 그런 공포감에 늘 시달렸었거든요. 그리고 방금 회사를 말씀드렸지만 뭐 대중 목욕탕, 헬스장, 수영장, 탈의실, 그리고 숙박업소, 그리고 길거리에서도 늘 그런 위협에 시달렸고요.
The statistics are startling, with the number of spy cam crimes reported to police surging from around 1,100 in 2010 to more than 6,500 last year. The offenders have included school teachers, professors, doctors, church pastors, government officials, police officers, and even a court judge. Asia's fourth largest economy takes pride in its tech prowess, from ultra-fast internet to cutting-edge smartphones. But these advances have also given rise to an army of tech-savvy peeping toms, with videos widely shared in internet chat rooms and on file-sharing sites, or used as adverts for websites promoting prostitution. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he was hopeful there would be progress towards freeing an American pastor whose detention in Turkey has sparked a diplomatic crisis. His upbeat tone came despite talks on Friday with his Turkish counterpart Mevlut Cavusoglu having failed to end the standoff surrounding Pastor Andrew Brunson, with Ankara warning that sanctions imposed by Washington would not work. Brunson, who led a Protestant church in the Aegean city of Izmir, is at the center of one of the most serious crises in relations between NATO allies in years. The pastor was moved to house arrest last week after nearly 2 years in jail on terror-related charges. But the change only increased tensions. The U.S. responded to the failure to fully free Brunson by hitting two top Turkish ministers with sanctions, prompting Ankara to threaten reciprocal measures. At a press conference, Pompeo insisted he had a constructive conversation with Cavusoglu on Friday on the sidelines of a regional security meeting in Singapore.
I made clear that it is well past time that Pastor Brunson be freed and be permitted to return to the United States and the others being held by Turkey also similarly must be freed as well. I'm hopeful that in the coming days we will see that occur, and I don't want to predict in the future what we might or might do to further enhance the likelihood that that occur. We had a good conversation. I'm very hopeful that we will make progress along that in the days and weeks ahead.
However, Hsien Loong struck a less positive tone after his meeting with Pompeo, also calling the talks constructive, but warning that threats and sanctions wouldn't work.
Taraftan tehdit diliyle ve yaptırımlarla hiçbir sonuca varılamayacağını da başından beri söyledik. Bugün yine bunu tekrarladık. Mike Pompeo ile yaptığımız görüşmede var olan sorunları nasıl çözeceğimizi, birlikte nasıl adım atacağımızı değerlendirdik. Bu anlamda son derece yapıcı bir görüşme olduğunu söyleyebilirim. Ülkeler arasında sorunlar olabilir, yaşanabilir, görüş ayrılığı da olabilir. Fakat biz Türkiye olarak her zaman bu sorunları diplomasiyle, diyalogla ve karşılıklı anlayışla ve mutabakatla çözmeyi arzu ettik.
Police in China are believed to have arrested a Chinese human rights critic in the middle of his August 1st interview on Voice of America Mandarin. Take a look. This is retired 84-year-old physics professor Sun Guangzhang. He was criticizing Chinese diplomacy with VOA when he started to live broadcast his own arrest. As you can hear here, Sun said in English, the police are here to interrupt again, and then started counting the number of police officers. The last word heard before the line went dead, where this is my freedom of speech. Since the incident, VOA says they've not been able to contact the activist, and the sources said he is in a military-run hotel. This was not Sun's first run-in with authorities. He was first detained in the 1960s, has had his pension cut, and he has not been allowed to travel abroad since 2005. AFP reports Sun is kept under regular surveillance. In other news, more than 500 elite members of Indonesian Army, Navy, and Air Force conducted anti-terror drills as part of security preparation ahead of the Asian Games. Chiefs of military and police say terrorism and street crime are among the top priorities. Indonesia will deploy tens of thousands of security personnel to prevent street crime and potential terrorist attacks during this month's Asian Games, according to police. Some 40,000 troops and police officers will be deployed in the capital Jakarta and Palembang in Sumatra, which are co-hosting the August 18 to September 2 games. Another 10,000 police officers will be on standby in Jakarta, while hundreds of CCTV surveillance cameras have been installed inside and outside sports venues. Authorities said security would be tightened at public places, including airports, malls, hotels, and tourist spots. More than 11,000 athletes from 45 countries are set to compete at the second biggest multi-sport event behind the Olympics. In other news, a Spanish NGO ship which rescued 87 migrants off the coast of Libya 2 days ago was still looking on Friday to dock at a port, with Italy close to them, according to the group Proactiva Open Arms. The migrants, nearly all from Sudan, including from Darfur, had spent 50 hours at sea on board an inflatable boat without drinking water, and many suffering burns from a mixture of fuel and salt water. Many of them jumped into the sea when the rescuers arrived on Wednesday for fear of being taken back to Libya, where migrants often suffer abuse, arbitrary detentions, extortion, and violence. But since the rescue, the NGO ship has been patrolling the waters of Libya looking for a port. Anywhere but not Italy, Italian Interior Minister Matteo Salvini has already warned via Twitter, repeating the new government's hardline policy, closing the country's ports to migrant rescue ships. Libya has emerged as a major transit point to Europe for those fleeing poverty and civil war elsewhere in Africa and the Middle East. Traffickers have exploited Libya's chaos following the 2011 uprising that toppled and later killed longtime dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Libyan authorities have stepped up efforts to stem the flow of migrants with assistance from European countries who are eager to slow a phenomenon that far right-wing parties have seized upon to gain electoral support. To Mexico now, Carlos Antonio Santamaria Diaz may be only 12 years old, but he has already enrolled in the National Autonomous University of Mexico and will begin his biomedical physics studies on Monday.
Que si logramos construir una célula que se mantenga por sí misma, organelo por organelo, hemos sido primero porque si funciona perfectamente todo lo que hace una célula normal, significa que sabemos todo lo necesario sobre ella para resolver sus enfermedades. Luego me impresiona el grado al que hemos llegado como especie, me impresiona que al punto que hemos llegado tanto de conocimiento como al grado que también hemos llegado de ignorancia, porque el conocimiento primero viene de admitirlo, es la propia ignorancia. Y también el poder a que hemos llegado, ¿no? El poder de destruirnos a nosotros mismos, el poder de destruir la vida en el universo.
The child prodigy earned his place in Mexico's most prestigious university after getting 105 points out of 109 in his admission test, becoming the youngest person to study a professional degree in the institution. Carlos said the biggest challenge wasn't the admission test, even though he says it was difficult because he still doesn't know a lot about integers, but the fact his parents had to convince institutions to let him take his middle and high school tests at a very early age. When not engaged in their school books, Carlos enjoys reading science, documents, and classic literature. The Philippine Embassy in Moscow, Philippine Ambassador to Russia, presented loyalty certificates and pins to its 3 personnel in recognition of the long service they have rendered to the embassy. Emi Coloma reports from Russia.
In a simple ceremony at the Philippine Embassy in Moscow, Philippine Ambassador to Russia presented loyalty certificates and pins to its 3 personnel in recognition of the long service they have rendered to the embassy and to the Department of Foreign Affairs. One of the awardees is Miss Eden La Forteza Saltin, who's been serving the embassy for 20 years as FSSE 1 Hsien Property Officer.
2 taon na po akong nagtatrabaho sa departamento ito at ako'y talagang magtrabaho dito sa embahada sa Moscow, Russia. Ang masasabi ko lang, sa 20 taon ng aking serbisyo ay sadyang masaya, makulay at puno-puno ng challenging. Pero masasabi kong may pagmamalaki ko ang taon kong serbisyo sa gobyerno, lalo na sa embahadang ito.
Another local hire, Ms. Cherry Narvaez, has been serving the embassy as FSSE 1 Attaché Assistant Political for 20 years.
I celebrated my 20 years in the Department of Foreign Affairs ngayong taon na to. So, bali, matanda na ako. Pero sa 20 years na yun, madami na din na experience at mga tulong na nagawa sa mga kababayan natin na sakop ng Russia. Masaya na malungkot, masaya pag nakakatulong kami at nagagawa namin ng paraan ng mga pangangailangan ng mga kababayan natin. Pero malungkot din pag yung may mga bagay din naman kasi na hindi namin kayang gawa ng paraan. Kumbaga, limitado din kakayahan namin na makatulong. Pero hanggat maaari, hanggat kaya,
tinutulungan natin. Sa ating mga kababayan, sa ating mga OFW, na kahit kami OFW din, magtiwala lang kayo sa embassy at gagawin namin yung aming makakaya, lahat ng aming makakaya para makatulong at mabigyan solusyon ang mga problema inyong kinakaharap. Kung kami man po ay may pagkukulang, humihingi po namin ang inyong pasensya at pangunawa. Salamat po.
Ms. Fima Kairmichu, who has been in the embassy for 15 years, is FSSO3 Attaché Finance Officer.
15 years na po dito sa Department of Foreign Affairs. Masasabi ko lang po na ang ating embahada, marami pong natutulungan ng kababayan natin, simula pa po dun sa unang bansang kung saan po ako nag-destino. Lahat po ng lumalapit na Pilipino, wala pong tinatanggihan, lalo na po sa mga repatriation. Lahat po yun ay ginugugulan ng Department of Foreign Affairs, lalo na po dito sa Philippine Embassy in Moscow.
It can be said that this is one good example wherein you can say that loyalty is very important to one's success. An employee must respect his duty of loyalty regardless of the industry he works in or position he has. Reporting from Moscow, Russia, this is Amy Coloma and I am 1 with 25.
Thank you, Emmy. Eagle News International will be right back. Stay tuned.
business news, this is Cesar Vallejos. Consumer prices likely accelerated further in July as the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas expects inflation to hit a fresh 5-year high on the back of increased utility rates, oil prices, and fares, higher excise tax on tobacco products, and more expensive rise in agricultural products. The BSP's Department of Economic Research said inflation would likely hover between 5.1 and 5.8% in July, primarily due to the increase in electricity rates in areas serviced by Meralco, as well as higher water rates imposed by Maynilad and Manila Water. Inflation rose to a fresh 5-year high of 5.2% in June, bringing the 6-month average to 4.3% and exceeding the BSP's 2 to 4% target, primarily due to rising global oil prices as well as the impact of the implementation of the train law. This prompted the BSP's Monetary Board to deliver a combined 50 basis point increase in interest rates through back-to-back hikes last May 10 and June 20 to curb rising inflationary pressures. BSP Governor Nestores Penilla Jr. said current inflation pressures are driven mainly by supply-side factors related to rising global oil prices, higher excise taxes, and weather-related disruptions, factors that are generally outside the scope of monetary policy. Government spending on infrastructure in the first half jumped 41.6% to 352.7 billion pesos, as well as exceeded the 6-month target as disbursements for some projects were front-loaded ahead of schedule. In a report, the Department of Budget and Management said expenditures on infrastructure and other capital outlays from January to June rose from 49.1 billion during the first 6 months of last year. In a statement, the DBM attributed the jump mostly to the implementation of road infrastructure projects by the Department of Public Works and Highways. The DBM said the projects implemented last June included the DPWH-led construction, widening, upgrading, and preventive maintenance of road networks nationwide, the Department of Education's repair and rehabilitation of classrooms and school facilities, the Department of Health's acquisition of hospital and medical equipment, as well as the Department of Transportation's rail transport projects and purchase of airport security equipment. Tuna canner Century Pacific Foods saw a slight increase in its income during the first 6 months of the year, despite a sales surge during the period, but it warned sales increases won't be as huge in the succeeding months as competition heats up and costs increase. The company said its profit reached 1.57 billion pesos for the 6-month period ending June, 7% higher than the previous month's 1.46 billion. The company said that local macroeconomic factors have favored demand for its products, which have wide appeal and broad consumer base, and expecting a sustained brand affinity with its improved distribution network. It is expecting rising costs in other parts of our business, including certain raw materials, packaging, freight, and other expenses that may cause margin pressure and temper earnings growth. Huawei Technologies pulled ahead of Apple to claim the #2 position in global smartphone shipments in the second quarter, just behind Samsung Electronics, solidifying the rise of Chinese competitors. Huawei shipped 54.2 million phones in the quarter, 41% more than a year earlier, to jump ahead of the iPhone maker for the first time, according to market research firm IDC. The telecoms giant accounted for 16% of the market, compared with 21% for South Korea's Samsung and 12% for Apple. Xiaomi, Corp, and Oppo, both based in China, rounded out the top 5. Chinese smartphone makers have been gaining influence as their domestic market grows and they expand abroad. Huawei has pushed into Europe and Africa, though it failed to crack the massive US market. Apple tends to sell iPhones at higher prices than its rivals and profits from services like iTunes, which help it top earnings estimates for the quarter. Reports said that it is the first time in 7 years that Samsung and Apple have not held the top 2 positions. Huawei's exclusion from the US has forced it to work harder in Asia and Europe to achieve its goals. Apple, the culture-changing company behind the iPod, iPhone, and iPad, hit another milestone on Thursday, becoming the first private sector company to surpass $1 trillion in market value. Shares of Apple finished the former Wall Street trading day at $207.39, topping the magic number 2 days after the California tech giant reported strong quarterly earnings. Apple is the first private sector company to reach this level. State oil company PetroChina briefly broke the $1 trillion barrier in 2007 during its initial public offering, but has since dropped back down. Behind Apple are Amazon, Google, parent Alphabet, Microsoft, and Facebook. $1 trillion is roughly the annual gross domestic product of Indonesia and more than twice that of Belgium, according to World Bank data from 2016. The landmark is the latest victory for Tim Cook, who faced skepticism when he took over as chief executive in 2011 from ailing iconic co-founder Steve Jobs. Jobs, who founded Apple in a Silicon Valley garage in 1976 with Steve Wozniak and built it into a global powerhouse, died in October 2011. After his death, analysts and other industry watchers wondered whether the company would lose its credibility, its ability to wow the world with the next big thing. But Cook has gradually won accolades from investors by pumping out a series of solid financial results and spreading Apple's products to China and other foreign markets. Singapore's Prime Minister said on Thursday he hoped to complete by the end of the year a massive China-backed regional trade pact that has taken center stage as Washington embarks on a unilateral protectionist agenda. The 16-nation regional comprehensive economic partnership is poised to become the largest free trade agreement in the world, covering about half of its population. It notably excludes the United States, which had been leading another regional trade pact, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, until President Trump abruptly abandoned it last year. The planned RCEP pact would group the 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, plus China, India, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. In his comments, which came at the start of a meeting of ASEAN foreign ministers in Singapore, Lee also warned about escalating global trade tensions. His remarks came soon after the U.S. escalated a trade row with China Wednesday by saying it was considering more than doubling threatened tariffs on a range of Chinese imports worth $200 billion.
I shall briefly mention 2 specific areas where we can do more together. First, economic integration, one of the 3 pillars of the ASEAN community. Trade tensions between the US and our other dialogue partners, including China, the EU, and Canada, have escalated. The rules-based multilateral trading system, which has underpinned ASEAN's growth and prosperity, is under pressure. It's important that ASEAN continues to support the multilateral system and work with like-minded partners to deepen our web of cooperation. I'm glad that ASEAN countries are redoubling their efforts to conclude the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, by the end of the year. The RCEP comprises ASEAN and our 6 FTA partners. It will be the world's largest trading bloc, covering 1/3 of the world's GDP. We are also working with the EU on the ASEAN-EU Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement, the first substantive aviation arrangement between 2 major regional groupings. When established, these 2, the RCEP and the ASEAN-EU CATA, will send a clear signal of ASEAN's commitment to trade liberalization and economic integration. I do not expect the negotiations to be easy, especially with a growing mood of nationalism and protectionism in many countries. Every participant will have to make trade-offs and difficult compromises. But I'm glad that ASEAN member states have taken a long-term approach and made a collective decision to stay on course in order to bring tangible benefits to our peoples. Secondly, we should make full use of technology to bring ASEAN closer together. The fourth industrial revolution is underway. ASEAN has to embrace innovation, build up our digital connectivity, and make ourselves ready for the future. We are forming the ASEAN Smart Cities Network. The 26 participating cities held the inaugural meeting last month. Singapore hopes that these cities will come together to establish a common framework for smart city development and to develop city-specific action plans and innovative projects that will improve the lives of our peoples.
Southeast Asia and Europe stressed the importance of pushing back against protectionism and the threat of global trade wars Friday as their ministers worked towards the eventual goal of a region-to-region free trade pact. The U.S. is embroiled in trade spats with China and close allies, including the European Union, imposing tit-for-tat tariffs on billions of dollars worth of goods and heightening fears of economic pain that could spread worldwide. At a meeting in Singapore, EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini assured her Southeast Asian counterparts that they could count on Europe as a free trade partner.
We stand on the side of a free and fair trade that benefits all instead of damaging trade wars. And we stand on the side of peace and security because we know that conflicts in our times have a global fallout. The bilateral trade agreements between the European Union and Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and possibly others will be the stepping stones towards a future region-to-region deal. If our two regions join forces, we could set a new standard for global trade, with more growth and more protection for our citizens, our goods, and our environment.
Followed by Minister Balakrishnan.
That's it for Business and ASEAN News. This is Cesar Vallejos. I'm 1 with 25. Eagle News International will be back. Stick with us.
to the garden. A world that recaptures the value of life, creating your moments, kindling your passion, worth reliving over and over. This is your world, your life, your garden.
The E-World Cup final that brings together 32 of the world's top FIFA 18 players starts in London and runs until Saturday, with the winner set to receive $250,000. New for this year, anti-doping measures put in place to detect possible cheating. Take a look.
2-1 up, then went 2-2 again, and you don't give anyone a chance to make it because he's played what? Gets himself a free kick. They just did in Russia.
I was playing football, like real football, since I was a kid, and like I think it's just go hand in hand. Like all football people love FIFA, so I just ended up playing my mates, and I never lost my mates. So and they just carried on, and I got to the competitive stuff. But definitely, like love of FIFA came from real football.
And here are the scores around the ground. Richard, you've been looking.
Oui, j'ai regardé la Coupe du Monde. Parce qu'au final, avant d'être fan de FIFA, je suis fan de foot. J'ai fait du football avant de commencer FIFA depuis tout petit. Et j'ai toujours rêvé d'être un footballeur un jour. Au final, j'ai réussi à être joueur de FIFA, de football virtuel. Donc on n'est pas si loin. Hein. Mais non, j'ai regardé la Coupe du Monde et ça donne envie. En fait, en vérité, ça donne envie d'être champion du monde. Parce que quand on voit tous les...
After liftoff from Kennedy Space Center in Florida on August 11, the Parker Solar Probe will become the first to fly directly into the sun's atmosphere, known as the corona. Take a look. The Parker Solar Probe is the first spacecraft to come close to the sun. It'll dive within just 6.2 million kilometers off the surface. That's more than 7 times closer than any spacecraft has come before. Scientists hope the spacecraft will revolutionize our understanding of the sun with its flares and eruptions. The size of a small car, the probe is equipped with a carbon composite heat shield to keep its instruments cool enough to operate. It's fitted with solar arrays and electric antennas. It'll also carry with it on a memory card the names of more than 1 million people who want to accompany the probe in spirit and cheer it on its way. The probe will use 7 venues flybys over a 7-year period, gradually reducing its orbit around the sun. It'll dive into part of the sun's atmosphere, the corona, for the first time, facing the ferocious heat and radiation around 1,300 degrees Celsius. On this part of its long journey, the probe's instruments will study electric and magnetic fields, plasma, and electric particles. Scientists hope the mission will answer crucial questions concerning space weather, why is the corona hotter than the sun's surface, and how is the solar wind accelerated. This will help forecast changes in the space environment that affect technology on Earth, satellite communications, power grid problems, pipeline erosion, radiation exposure on airline flights, and astronaut safety. The mission is expected to last until 2025. Men have died from heat stroke in Spain as Europe sweltered in a record heat wave Friday, with temperatures hitting scorching 45 degrees Celsius. That's around 113 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. Take a look. Meteorologists saying only little relief is in sight in the coming days. A middle-aged man in Barcelona, who media said appeared to be homeless, was found collapsed on a street and taken to hospital, where he later died of heat stroke. Catalunya Civil Protection Agency said in a statement. 2 other men, a road worker in his 40s and a 78-year-old pensioner, also died from heat stroke this week. Madrid and most of the central and southwestern Spain were on orange alert, with temperatures as high as 45 degrees Celsius predicted. In Portugal, temperatures topped a record 45 degrees in Alvega, 150 kilometers north of Lisbon. The heat wave is expected to reach its peak on Saturday, according to the Portuguese Institute for Sea and Atmosphere. While no substantial wildfires have been reported so far, the emergency services say they remain on maximum alert. And Interior Minister Eduardo Cabrita declared a policy of zero tolerance towards risky activities such as barbecues. Portugal and Spain are facing a major heat wave, with the mercury expected to soar before peaking at 47 degrees Celsius in some areas this weekend. Temperatures are being driven higher by a hot air mass moving northward from Africa. Meanwhile, as a heat wave bakes France, with temperatures set to break 40 degrees in parts, Parisians, tourists, and even dogs all rally around fountains and water sprays to cool down. Take a look. Meanwhile, South Korea issued a nationwide heat wave warning. Take a look. The temperature in Seoul reached 38.8 degrees Celsius, the highest since 1907 when the country began to compile weather data. A heat wave warning has been issued nationwide by the government, asking people to be careful during outdoor activities and to drink plenty of water. The extreme weather is expected to continue for the rest of the week. An official said while several factors are behind the extreme heat wave this year, the main cause is the high atmospheric pressure from northern China and southern Mongolia, which has expanded to reinforce the North Pacific anti-cyclone. A report published by the UN-backed Sustainable Energy for All said that about 1.1 billion people face immediate risks from lack of access to cooling. Access to cooling is now a fundamental issue of equity, and as temperatures hit record levels, this could also mean the difference between life or death for some. These risks are both a development and climate change issue, as they pose challenges for the health, safety, and productivity of populations across the world, especially countries in Asia and Africa, where access gaps are the largest.
About 1.1 billion people face significant risks from a lack of access to cooling. Those are sort of divided by, so that you have about 470 million people in poor rural areas who don't have access to safe food and medicines, and about 630 million people in hotter, poor urban slums or informal settlements with little or no cooling to protect them against extreme weather spikes.
The report, Chilling Prospects Providing Sustainable Cooling for All, says that cooling underpins the ability of millions to escape poverty, to keep children healthy, vaccines stable, food nutritious, and our economies productive.
previous research indicates that by 2050, work hour losses by country due to excessive heat and lack of access to cooling are expected to be more than 2% and as high as 12% in some places. The worst affected regions will be South Asia and West Africa. And finally, the WHO estimates that nearly 50% of freeze-dried and 25% of liquid vaccines are wasted each year, with cold chain disruptions being one of the biggest reasons.
The report also said to represent an urgent call to action and specific recommendations to government policymakers, business leaders, investors, and civil society to increase access to sustainable cooling solutions for all.
So cooling for all is about how we make affordable, reliable, sustainable cooling solutions that address people's specific needs, their needs for cooling for comfort and for productivity, their needs for cooling to guarantee the safety of the vaccine supply chain, and their need for access to cold chains to guarantee the safety of their food. It is important that we put cooling front and centre in the ways in which we meet people's needs. If we don't, in a world that is warming, in a world where we're seeing and experiencing extreme variations in weather and volatility due to climate impacts already, and in a world where more and more people in low incomes are moving into cities and people are living in very fragile and vulnerable circumstances on vulnerable land because of climate change, if we don't address the needs that these people have for cooling, then we are buying a much more expensive, in terms of human life and in terms of economic growth, a much more expensive problem in the future.
Meanwhile, Chile makes history as it becomes the first country in Latin America to ban the commercial use of plastic bags. We can't continue polluting as if we own the earth, says President Sebastián Piñera at a public ceremony in the center of Santiago, after which he handed out cloth bags to passers-by. Take a look.
Debemos pasar de la cultura de lo desechable, todo se usa y se bota, a la sana cultura de lo reciclable. Somos 7.600 millones de habitantes en la Tierra. No podemos cada uno seguir contaminando como si la Tierra nos perteneciera.
Australia vowed to vehemently oppose a new push by Japan to undermine a global moratorium on commercial whaling and urged like-minded nations to stand firm against Tokyo. Japan has regularly sought an easing of the International Whaling Commission's or IWC prohibition on commercial whaling and continues to kill the animals under what it calls a scientific research program despite international criticism. At September's IWC meeting in Brazil, Tokyo said it plans to propose setting a catch quota for species whose stocks are recognized as healthy by the IWC Scientific Committee. Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop said Australia strongly supports the 30-year global moratorium on commercial whaling and will vehemently oppose any attempts to undermine the processes that support it. Hideki Moronuki, an official in charge of whaling at Japan's fisheries agency, said in June the proposal would not specify which whale species and how many mammals Japan wants to hunt. But he said the IWC classifies several species as no longer depleted. Japanese officials said the high rate of pregnant whales showed the strength of the mink population. Tokyo claims its scientific research is necessary to remove whale populations are large enough to sustain, and it said that whale populations are large enough to sustain a return to commercial hunting. Bishop said this was not correct. Eagle News International will be right back. Stay tuned.
MTRCB ang mag-provide ng appropriate ratings sa lahat ng TV shows. Para ugaliin ng pamilya ang responsableng panonood. Teamwork tayo, parents! Rated G, good for all!
No,
Oops! Rated PG! Dapat may mga magulang para sagutin ang mga tanong ng kabataan.
Grabe! Rated SPG! Maselan!
Higpitan ang paggabay.
Pag rated MTRCB, rated responsable.
Welcome to the garden. A world that brings you back to that natural, carefree feeling of joy and happiness. A place where art becomes your song to strengthen bonds. Creating your moments, kindling your passion, worth reliving over and over. A world that recaptures the value of life. Breathe. This is your world, your life, your garden.
The Hawaiian town of Eva Beach played an important part for the Iglesia ni Cristo or Church of Christ in its religious movement overseas that began on July 27, 1968. Likewise, this now sprawling suburban community in West Oahu already had a rich history of its own, dating all the way back to the 19th century. EBC Hawaii correspondent Alfred Asenas has this special feature.
Just like the pineapple, the sugar cane would play a pivotal role in shaping Hawaii's economy for more than a century, as it changed from a basic subsistence agriculture to a more complex, commodity-based system with the intent to satisfy demands for all things sweet on a global scale.
Sugar would alter the landscapes of the western side of Oahu Island, with large areas of cane plantings along with the construction of sugar mills to process crops. Nearby towns would soon flourish, namely Waipahu and Eva.
The Eva Plantation Company was incorporated in 1890 with about 11,000 acres of land, roughly 4,400 hectares. This new entity would soon form a critical business partnership with the Oahu Railway System in delivering large amounts of harvest throughout Hawaii and beyond.
Approximately 30 miles or roughly 48 kilometers of railroad track serviced the plantation. Sugar from the mill was conveyed by the Oahu Railway and Land Company to Honolulu Harbor for shipping to the continental U.S. and worldwide.
Well, Hawaii's railways began with plantation railroads. By the time Dillingham came in the late 1800s and decided to build a railroad, there were plenty of plantations. The Oahu Railway was built in part to connect all the plantations to bring that product to Honolulu so it could get shipped away. The Oahu Railway and Land Company was a common carrier railroad. They were no different than a big railroad on the mainland back then. They hauled freight, passengers, you name it, they hauled it. And one of the things they did bring was the processed sugar. A lot of people always say it's a sugarcane train. It's not. The Oahu Railway never hauled sugarcane. That would have been the plantation railroads, whether it was the Eva Plantation, Waialua, wherever.
Now, because of the proximity to Pearl Harbor, the Eva plantations were not immune to the collateral damage of machine gun fire and anti-aircraft shells brought about during the Japanese attacks on December 7, 1941. With America entering World War II, the U.S. Army took possession of over 500,000 acres, roughly about 2,000 square kilometers of farmlands to be converted to training camps and storage facilities, some of which are still in use to this day.
A booming sugar industry obviously meant more workers in the farmlands. The importation of labor from countries in Asia, Europe, and the Americas would become the main reason for the multi-ethnic makeup of Hawaii's current population. One of those countries was the Philippines, and its migrant workers would become known as Sakaras.
The Sakaras, who were early plantation laborers who immigrated to Hawaii between 1906 and 1946, worked extremely hard to give their families better lives. And as a result, many of their descendants and children had gone on to attain higher education, gaining their bachelor's, their master's, their PhDs, and now working professionals across the state of Hawaii. Some being very visible in government, in education, in healthcare, and across many sectors.
One of those sectors included propagating their spiritual beliefs and convictions to other Filipinos and even non-Filipinos, especially around the gathering place that is Oahu Island.
More specifically, it involved some migrant workers and their families right here in Eva, who would soon discover that they had something unique in common: their membership in a small yet growing religious organization known as the Iglesia Ni Cristo Church of Christ. From that moment on, they would lay the foundation for something bigger, much bigger, in the days and years to come. Reporting from Eva Beach, Hawaii, I'm Alfred Esenas for Eagle News, 1 with 25. Mahalo for watching.
Mahalo, Alfred, and that's it for tonight's broadcast. I'm Alma Angeles, always 1 with 25. Good night.